I am a real believer in sort of young talent, and if you throw someone in at the deep end, obviously with lots of support to like make sure they don't drown, it's amazing what people can achieve. And never to like kind of make assumptions about what someone can or cannot do, like let them give it a go and take some risks.
This is The Summit by Fearless Adventures. I'm David Newns, and every week my co-founder Dominic McGregor and I will be talking to inspirational leaders about their experiences as they strive towards their summit. Thanks for joining us here at The Summit, Fearless Adventures podcast, where we talk to amazing leaders of companies that are building fantastic brands and products. Today we're joined by Pippa Murray from Pippa Nut, who has built an amazing FMCG business over the past 8 years. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talk to us about when you came up with the idea, when it was. Just give us that little story about how you came to the idea of doing this.
Yeah, so we've been we've been training about 8 years now, but I came up with the idea 2 years before that. So almost 10 years have been something that I've been sort of focused working on. I came up at the idea, and I guess context, my background wasn't actually in food and drink at all. So I was working as a theatre producer of all things. Wow. Had only really just got into my career. So I was 24 at the time when I sort of first had the idea, and really didn't have a business bone in my body whatsoever. Had no idea what FMCG was or stood for, frankly, but very much thought about it from a kind of problem that I saw as a consumer and a product that I loved and consumed regularly, but saw a gap in the market. So, you know, at the time I was doing lots of kind of marathon running. In fact, I was running the Paris Marathon that year, and it was kind of during some of those long runs that the idea started forming. And for me, as someone that was interested in fitness and health and obviously a keen runner, I was always looking for kind of food that would fuel kind of my training. And nut butters and peanut butters are brilliant. They're a source of good protein and good fats and energy. So it's something I went to a lot. But back then, nearly every single product that I picked up in store was filled with palm oil, which is one of the biggest forms of deforestation, as well as also not being that good for you, but also just really, really processed. And I think over the last 10 years, there's been a real transformation of food these days. Like there is more kind of natural brands on the shelves in terms of ones that don't use ingredients you wouldn't recognize. And I think I really wanted to be part of that movement at that time, sort of thinking about how can you bring sort of better for you options to people's tables. And in this case, make a really natural, delicious product. It doesn't kind of feel like a sacrifice in any way. And yeah, I think the brand itself was a real opportunity. The space was very dusty, and I think with food and drink, you either create a whole new category. I don't know, you do what coconut water does, or you look for a dusty space in store and look at how you could disrupt it. Maybe the brands that have been there have become a bit lazy, and that's the opportunity to bring in something fresh and new and better for consumers. So yeah, that was like the sort of kernel of the idea, I guess, and it took about 2 years to get the brand up and running. Out supply chain, raise the money, do the product development, and then we got going. We listed in Selfridges. That was our first customer, and we've built it since then.
Wow. Okay. So many questions. Okay. So going back, so you were in theatre production.
Yeah.
And you saw a gap in the market.
Yeah.
And did you know anything about food technology, or who was the first person you called?
That's such a good question. I think. Before I jump into that, I think one of the things that is actually sometimes a real advantage is to come at something without any preconceived conceptions of what it should work like. And I guess it's that kind of first principle thinking where actually you question everything, partly because you literally have no idea what you're doing. But yeah, who is it that I called? I mean, I had a couple of people who worked in food and drink brands at the time that were mates from university. I think they were like my first port of call to kind of think about let me ask you a few questions about how it works in food and drink. My second one was at the time I was also really obsessed with markets, and and I live in London, have done so since university, and at that time food truck world was really kicking off. The likes of Curb, really great food truck company were there, and you had markets popping up all around London, lots of independent little brands popping up in those sort of spaces. And so rather than necessarily asking or going to lots of people, I did start quite physically in terms of I literally made my product in my kitchen, developed the different flavors and recipes. I'm a real foodie at heart. So, and just very practically got going with some very basic branding and some product that I'd make literally out of my kitchen. And I sold at Maltby Street Market down in South London for a few months. And that was like my learning ground. And I guess through that you start, but the act of doing and putting yourself out there, I think inevitably it also means that you start to organically build your network a little bit more. You start to see brands that you really think are amazing, and you think, oh, could I try and get like a half an hour phone call with them? So it's a bit of a mixture of like, who do you know, who do you want to know, and therefore put yourself out there. And then I think there is a real, particularly in, I guess, a product-based business, you do have to be quite, I think you have to be quite active. And if you can, like, markets are like such a great way to test and learn when you have zero experience whatsoever. So that was like, I think, some of the things that I thought about.
Did people love your first product, or was it like, oh my God, this is awful?
Yeah, I mean, so I did a bit of road testing ahead with my like friends and family, and there definitely were some dodgy flavors, and it took me a bit of time. I think for things like sourcing like good quality nuts, as an example, like figuring that out or working it through. But by the time I got to like market stores, and I was actually like, you know, it was a product that I was selling. Maybe not something you'd find in a supermarket, but it was good for what it was at that stage. That actually was what gave me the confidence to carry on, because I got people coming back week on week. People gave me really great feedback immediately in that moment, which you could then pivot your recipe a little bit. So I think actually it gave me confidence to then say, okay, I'm going to figure out how to scale this up and make it a commercially scalable product, and look at manufacturing and actually get into the real detail of like, how does a food and drink brand work?
And when you started on the market stall, was it just, I want to do this for me, or did you actually have an ambition at that point to make this a big brand? Or did that come slightly after, once you had that kind of feedback?
Yeah, I think when I was thinking up the business, I always wanted it to be a brand that you'd find in supermarkets. Yeah. So the market stall was just a real stepping stone to get started. Okay. It was a friend of mine who ran a charity at the time was like, Pip, you just need to get going. He'd said that to me, and I was like, okay, I will physically literally get out the door and do it. But when I thought about the impact that I wanted to make, I think that one of the best things about running a business is that you have a platform that you can help drive change through, whether that's through your product, but also in the way that you do business. So, and the bigger your brand gets, the more impact you can have in a positive way, hopefully. And so I always wanted to be found in people's covers up and down the UK and further afield as well. So that was always front of mind when I was thinking about how I was going to set up the business as well.
And then, going back now 8 years, you know, we meet so many entrepreneurs today, and their ambition is to create a product they want to see on the supermarket shelf, right? That's kind of when they walk into a room, that's the thing they say. Do you think it's easier or harder now, 8 years later, if you were to start again? You're mentoring a budding entrepreneur who's just created another kind of interesting FMCG product. What would you say their route should be to get onto the shelf of a supermarket?
It's such a good question. It's something I do toss up in my mind, even when I think, well, if I would do another business, would it be harder or easier? I think there's a few things. I think the current climate makes it hard. However, whenever there's any disruption, you know, whether that's COVID or right now we've got, you know, inflation and cost of living crisis, naturally some businesses will fail, but it will leave gaps and opportunities for new ideas to emerge. And so in some ways, I think when it's a little bit unsteady like it is at the moment, even though it's quite difficult from a product perspective when you've got inflation hitting your supply chain, it does leave room and opportunity, if that makes sense. So in some ways, I think that's a really great opportunity because almost, you know, the ones that do get on the shelves are probably going to succeed better because they've had to start up in a really challenging time. So they have to have great margins from the get-go, or they do have to make sure their product is genuinely needed because people right now are being really selective about what they buy. So I think maybe make sure that the right products do get out there in the world. And I think right now what's brilliant is that there is such a community, and I think it has been really for the last 10 years, it still continues, and it just amazing sort of burgeoning group of SME sort of food and drink startups, which are incredibly open, and there's a kind of pathway to kind of, you can speak to other businesses 2 years in front and you can really kind of get their help and assistance. And there are, you know, lots of organisations that help and support startups in that early stage. And obviously you've got things like SEIS and EIS that help, and crowdfunding that really democratises, you know, finance. So there's so many benefits, I think. But I think certainly if you're starting up a food and drink product right now, like being very conscious of the climate, you really need to make sure you're solving a problem, that there's a genuine need. You're not just doing another and me, because that won't get you won't get consumers seeing the value and the benefit in your product. You have to offer something different so you can offer a higher value product, if that makes sense, or a product where people see more value in it because you're solving or improving upon something that is in the market, if that makes sense. If it is just replicating, then nobody's going to pick it up over an existing brand that they're already familiar with.
That segues nicely into my next question, which is about brand.
Yeah.
And, building a brand and in today's world is really tough, right? Standing out, getting your message across. I know you just spoke there about being able to kind of articulate why your product's different or what problem it's solving. How did you do that? I mean, was it a slam dunk? Was it really easy and clear to say what problem you were solving? Or did that iterate over time? And how did you stand out on shelf?
I guess from the get-go, I always had a problem in mind, really intrinsic in this particular product. But it does like broaden and become a bigger kind of purpose for us as a business. And I think I didn't have like a really beautifully articulated purpose that I had from day dot in all of our pitch decks and stuff. It actually was something that came 3 years in, and it was sort of the small team that I had at that time that we were like, right, I think it's time that we like figure out, yes, we all kind of know why we're here, but let's really articulate this. So that did come a bit later, and now it's really about, creating products that people absolutely love, that do them some good from a health perspective, but are light on the planet as possible. And that's our sort of why I do what I do. But in terms of articulating and how you actually make sure that comes through when people are buying a product, like, I think if you're going to invest your marketing money in anywhere when it comes to food and drink, you invest it in your brand and your packaging. Because, most people are just like sleepwalking through their shopping, especially right now. People literally go into supermarkets with a list and say, this is what I'm going to buy. So you do have to be disruptive on shelf. And so working on making sure that your brand cuts through from both making sure you're communicating the right thing at shelf, but also that it has like a standout is just so vital. It will pay back time and time again. And then really always from the beginning, but it still applies now as we're a bigger brand, really focusing at like, where can you invest your marketing spend as close to shelf as possible, and then sort of slowly work out as you get bigger and bigger. But, at the beginning, it's so simple, like, if your product is amazing, tastes delicious, and really your job is to try and get as many people to try it as possible. So whether that's sampling at shelf, to doing events in and around kind of London, to making sure that you're sending out product to influencers to get them to talk about your brand and again, raise awareness about why that other people should buy it. You really try and, as much as possible, like do as much of that close to where you're already, where your distribution is in an ideal world, and then work outwards from there.
We see a lot of companies that have started in one channel, so maybe they have a great direct-to-consumer base and they're trying then to get into retail.
Yeah.
One of the big things they all struggle with hugely is cash flow.
Yeah.
Because going from a system where, they basically get paid as soon as they sell a product to a whole new world of, paying suppliers up front all the way through to being paid by retailers, in a long time in the future. How did that stunt your growth, or how did you manage that?
Yeah, I actually don't think this gets spoken about enough in terms of how do you actually manage that back end, because the way you set up your business will really enable you to drive growth and be able to go for it, or to your point, like really stem it. And I think there are like some really basic principles around making sure your supply chain is set up effectively so that you're not having to pay for goods up front, which is often what people have to do when they're building those first relationships with those factories. But it comes back to like, spend time, don't rush the startup bit where you're just getting the foundations laid. Spend time nurturing and finding the right partner from a manufacturing perspective, as an example, who believes in your brand enough to give you even some short payment terms that means that you're not going to be hamstrung every time you have to raise an order to pay for it up front. So, in an ideal world, you get 60-day terms. That might not be possible. But like, trying to work on like what can that look like? And ultimately, that's what I mean with spend time sort of, kissing a lot of frogs, because eventually you will find the right partners that will actually support you and give you maybe a little bit of rope to go after. And similarly, this is where you have to be really mindful about how you build your distribution. And you don't want to turn down Tesco if they do start knocking on your door, which is unlikely. They don't often come knocking, but sometimes they do. But just being really mindful about how you build your distribution. It's better to like sweat one store than have 500 that aren't working very well. Like for us in say Sainsbury's, 80% of our sales will be coming through the top 100 stores out of the 800 or 700 that we're listed in. So just because you have loads of doors open and your product's on shelf, although it's good for awareness, it doesn't actually mean it necessarily will sell more. So build your brand through your distribution. So for instance, we started with the likes of Selfridges, then we went into Whole Foods, then we started to dip our toe into retailers like Ocado and Holland & Barrett, and it was only until the back end of our first year that we got our first national retailer, which was Sainsbury's, and really we worked with Sainsbury's for 2 years before we went anywhere else, and we got more breadth and depth of distribution in that store. We could have gone far and wide with, Asda, Tesco, Morrison's, but you end up just having to cut your marketing budget over all of those different areas. And to your point, like, all your cash gets tied up in a more complicated sort of chain. So, yeah, being really mindful about the terms you agree up front with your supermarkets and your manufacturers, but also be conscious about how you build it. But look, there have been some moments, and I do specifically remember with Sainsbury's when we sent in our first load of products into that particular retailer, and I remember we were down to like £5 in the bank.
Yeah.
There were some really sketchy times,
moments,
and so I don't know if there's an inevitability about that, which doesn't sound hugely, it sounds a bit irresponsible. But yeah, like I think that's kind of part of like that kind of risk that you are always going to be slightly straddling, that it's not going to be perfect. You have to accept it. Just be mindful about the choices you're making as you're building your brand.
So in terms of your own personal journey, we're talking about, reaching a summit. What is your summit? Are you there yet? Are you past it? Are you on the way up? What does it look like? When you get there, what will it look like?
I find that a really difficult question, actually, because I always think the nature of like being an entrepreneur or, anyone running a business is that you think that when you get to it, like for me, when I started off, I was like, well, if we just get into Waitrose, that'll be like job done. Like I can just go home after that. So that's the dream. And then like as soon as you start to realize the potential of your brand, you start to stretch that goal even further and further and further out. And I think when I was younger, I often used to think much more in terms of revenue. Like when I get to this revenue goal of X million, that's when like I'll be like, nailed it, again, can go home or whatever it is. But I found that really difficult over time when either we've had a year where it's been a tougher year and we haven't hit some of those goals. And actually thinking about what kind of business I want to be responsible for creating in this world today, I've completely rethought how I think about success and what I think about a summit as an example. So Pippa Nut's a B Corp, so that's a business that thinks about the triple bottom line on equal footing, so people, planet and profit. And really in the last sort of 3 to 4 years, our kind of what kind of impact from a sustainability but also a social perspective we want to make has really shifted for me. If I look back in 5 years' time, I want to make sure that Pippa Nut is a brand that is leading the way when it comes to environmental and social responsibility. Like I want to be that poster child. We might not be the biggest brand out there, but I want to be an example for other businesses that you don't just have to drive growth at all costs, and really you should be thinking about really conscious capitalism when you're thinking about your product and your brand. So if we can really embed that in our company and deliver upon some of the goals that we've got in our brand around things like net zero and thinking about how we can make sure that our packaging is responsible and we're doing interesting work from an agricultural perspective, that for me makes me really excited, because I think we're going to have to completely transform the way that businesses, particularly physical products that have such a big impact on the environment, like climate change is happening. So that's for me, I would feel prouder if we're still around doing good work and making really great products for people, true to our values, and that's success.
I mean, on the opposite side of the coin, obviously every journey is a roller coaster. We just spoke about when there's no money left and when it's all gone amazingly well and everything in between. Has building a business been a personal sacrifice to you?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, most of my 20s, so I started, the idea was 24, the business launched when I was 26, and in fact, my entire sort of mid-20s and early 30s has been consumed by this company. And when I think about sometimes when you level yourself up to like maybe your friends or university friends, whatever it is, you're always, well, I certainly have been a few steps behind from a personal perspective, whether that's really sort of basic milestones like, buying a flat, which is obviously a privilege in itself, but things like that, I think you always put, other people first in front of you, like even just basic stuff like what you pay yourselves. Most people in my company, or even now still to today, still get paid more than me. And that sort of, I guess, literal sacrifice that you're making in the view that in the long run, you're investing in a brand and a business that is going to be a success. So I think that does, and I think ultimately over time you do start to set better boundaries around your work and your life. But I actually always think it's just that lovely mix that is kind of what is running a business. You never really have a clear boundary, but I do think you do get better as you get more mature in your company about not just being busy for the sake of it, which I think in the first couple of years I was just 24 hours busy working on it, and then you realise that like you're just really ineffective and inefficient. And I don't know if that's just the natural way of hustling. It's just the way it is. But inevitably, I think you get better now. I think about being more like conscious about, well, what do I also want to achieve in my personal life, and trying to think not just solely about like work. I don't know if I've necessarily cracked it yet, though.
Journey.
It's a journey, I think, for sure.
And what would your team say about you?
I think they would say that I try to be a very autonomous, sort of, democratic, and from an autonomy perspective, let people run with things and not to crowd in too much. I think there's something about because I started up my company literally with no kind of appreciation or understanding of what I was doing, but you learn a lot by doing and getting and making some mistakes and getting yourself out there. I am a real believer in sort of young talent and really sort of, if you throw someone in at the deep end, obviously with lots of support to like make sure they don't drown, it's amazing what people can achieve. And never to like kind of make assumptions about what someone can or cannot do, like let them give it a go and take some risks. And I hope that my team would say that I let that happen in Pippa Nut, and that I create that kind of flat culture. They'd also probably say I'm very sort of humble. I do get that quite a lot. I do downplay a lot of either our success or my success. So I'm not one to jump on top of a table and say, look at me. So I'm probably in lots of ways, when I thought about entrepreneurship or leadership, I'm not a normal kind of what I thought a leader was. I'm not a complete introvert, but I definitely straddle the introvert-extrovert spectrum. And so that took quite a while for me to like figure out, well, I'm not a kind of Richard Branson kind of leader.
Absolutely.
And so I think they'd probably say that I'm a quieter, but perhaps less out there person, but still lead in my own way, if that makes sense.
It's fantastic to hear that, because I think, there's a lot I think about diversity of leadership skills, especially in the investment community. People expect a leader to be a certain type of sort of outgoing, bounces into a room, everyone kind of looks up and goes, wow, actually, I think really true leaders there's lots of different type of leadership qualities, and from the investment perspective, we need to appreciate that more.
I agree. And I think as well, like, you can be very loud and take up a lot of space in a room, but I think good leadership is letting other people be heard and actually listening more than you're speaking. And I think that can be a real asset if, like, of course, you need to be able to stand up in front of people and be confident and sell in your purpose and make sure everyone's really clear about the direction. But it doesn't mean you have to be like bullish and kind of really alpha in your approach. So I like to think it gives space for other people to like actually be even better and to like level themselves up and contribute. So but I do agree, I think there is a profile that is perhaps looked at, and I think perhaps that comes from also just the lack of diversity in itself in some of that world that you're speaking about. Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Pip, for joining us today. Thank you. Absolute pleasure being here. Thank you. Thanks for watching this episode of The Summit. We've been joined here by Pippa Murray from Pippa Nut. It's been amazing to hear about your journey and your stories, and especially for me, I think the most interesting piece was this: learn when to say no to retailers, and that was really, really eye-opening for us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please like it, please follow it, please tell your friends, and if you think of anyone we should be interviewing on the podcast, please let us know. Thank you.